no. You are not going to use a USA label or anything that implies USA unless it's born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S.
Leo McDonnell is my guest today as we get his take on the changes that the USDA made regarding product of USA labeling on beef products.
This thing actually came out much better as far as labeling than what we had in the Farm Bill in mandatory cool.
And as we know, country of origin labeling has been a controversial issue in our industry for a good many years. So what clicked? What was it that made these latest changes that brought agreement amongst industry groups that have been in odds in the past on this issue? We'll discuss that, as well as his thoughts on WTO, the results of the consumer survey on beef products, and why he believes this voluntary approach to country of origin labeling could build cooperation in the industry.
The other thing about when you have a voluntary label like this, it requires people to work together from all segments of the industry.
Leo McDonnell, my guest today on the USDA's revisions to beef products carrying the product of the USA label. That's today on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. This is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Glad to have you tuned in and joining us on our program. If you're not a regular listener to the show, I want to point out that if you go to our podcast website at workingranchradio.com, say you're listening on the radio and you missed something, or you're on the podcast and you just caught it for the first time, I would encourage you to go back and listen just to even the last four. Now, we've got a lot of shows that have a lot of life in them. What I mean by that is that's a topic that's relevant no matter when you listen to it. But this last four that we've had, just want to point those out. Last week it was episode 161. What does the state of Kansas have to do with your operation? Then in episode 160, Dal Houston joined us as we were talking about trying to simplify some of the questions regarding estate planning. Back in episode 159, Dr. Lacey Farmeyer joined us as we talked about lameness. Actually, the title was Lameness, a Canary in the Coal Mine. And there's something to that title. There's a meaning why we use that. And then prior to that episode was episode 158 as Dr. Mark Johnson with Oklahoma State Extension joined us as we talked about what's the value of a good bull. So a lot of great episodes, not only those four, but other previous ones as well. And I think you'll find today's very informative as well. Don't forget to stay tuned later on in the show as meteorologist Don Day will be in with a look at our long-term weather, and the Captain Tim O'Byrne in with this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. Well, as we turn to our subject at hand, we are talking about the changes and the finalization of the rule that the USDA released last month regarding the usage of product of USA labeling on beef products, a change that moved that to a voluntary process, that if that claim was to be put on beef products, there would be, if they wanted to do that, there would be a series of steps that they need to know that that product was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed, packaged, all of those kinds of things that we've all thought about has to be done in the U.S. And so with that, I thought none other than to have Leo McDonnell joining us as our guest here today. Of course, a lot of folks would be familiar with him and his name. He's been a proponent of some element of this for many, many years, and we're going to talk about that today. But first of all, Leo, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
You bet. Nice to be here. Thank you, Justin.
Well, Leo, when the news broke last month regarding the USDA's product of the USA label ruling, you were one of the first ones I thought about, because as we talk about this particular ruling that we're going to get into more here today and its implications to country of origin labeling, as we were talking before we went on air, this has really been something that you have been advocating for since about 1999.
Yes. Yep. We have. It's been a long road. And then we got it into the Farm Bill in 2005. I actually spent a couple of days out there in D.C. during the conference committee when the House and the Ag gets together to finalize the Farm Bill. I sat there with Grassley's staff as he fought for the Senate side to keep cool on, and the House side and some of the Texans and Californians were trying to get rid of it. So, I've testified at 2 or 3 different hearings on it. Actually, in 2015, when they repealed mandatory cool, I was the only proponent to keep it that testified at the U.S. Senate hearing on repealing cool. And, been a long road, but we got there finally.
Yeah. As you look back over the years through this, Leo, and it has evolved, there's definitely been pressure. Of course, the other phrase we always hear, as you had said, is country of origin labeling. As this evolved and as this happened, how has it happened in a way that you didn't expect? Because I know with what we're seeing now, it was unique in that most of the organizations were in favor of it. Maybe it wasn't at the beginning, but from where you started in 1999 to where we're at, what needed to have happened in order for it to get to this point that we see now?
Oh, wow. There was a lot of stuff went on, Justin, and a lot of things that surprised me. I mean, when we started this in 1999, it was kind of like, it's like a no-brainer. 99% of the imported products coming into the U.S. are labeled from what country they come from. So we were surprised at the opposition, and maybe that was just our naiveness. I was surprised at the opposition that we got from within our own industry. Of course, that's always your most damaging opposition. But, we just kept working our way through it. And then at the same time, I was really surprised by the different groups and whatnot outside of the cattle industry that really got behind this in the early years. Some of these large consumer groups. So some of that was pretty cool. Yeah.
So then, Leo, after that initial push of introducing the concept of country of origin labeling, as you had said, a little bit of surprise within the own industry that we had some division, and yet we did have support from entities outside of the cattle industry. So what happened next?
We started out trying getting the bill through and making it law, and we had country of origin labeling for 6-7 years until 2015 when our House and Senate repealed it. Which was kind of weird because we'd had it for about 7 years and we didn't see all the terrible things that were going to happen that the naysayers said, that it was going to slow imports down. Well, it definitely didn't slow imports down. That it was going to make it more costly and cattle producers would get less and, retailers would have to charge more and we'd see a larger margin between production and retailing or processing. We didn't see that happen. In fact, surprisingly, when they repealed this in 2015, we thought the margin, if there had been some really high undue costs, that we'd see the margins tighten, the spread between cattle and wholesale and retail beef. And instead, once they repealed it, those margins just took off and they never settled back down. I mean, it just got crazy. So anyway, when we lost cooling, they repealed the law in 2015. Then in 17, there was a couple groups filed for a little more truth in labeling, cool type deal like we're getting today. We looked at what had been filed and we didn't think it was broad enough. So then we filed a 200-page document. It was very costly. There was ranchers all across the West that we wrote letters to that helped pay for the lawyer costs and stuff like that. It was pretty neat, Justin. I just was really heartwarming. And we got this huge document. And, since then, it's the only other petition that was filed that maybe could have hurt us was in 2021. NCBA filed a petition trying to eliminate the use of product of USA labels. And they wanted to replace it with a label called processed in the USA. Well, that was kind of a non-starter even for USDA or FSIS. I mean, anything that comes into this country is pretty much processed, whether it's live cattle or imported meat, beef that's ground. But it just seemed like we hit a lot of closed doors going along, but we had a lot of open doors, too. So anyway, we got there.
Yeah. So what was the thing then that happened between then and now? And you just mentioned that the industry wasn't necessarily all in agreement, but yet when this final ruling came out from the USDA on addressing product of the USA labeling, most of the cattle industry groups and definitely those that have been in opposition in years past are all in agreement. What changed?
I don't think anything's really changed. Farm Bureau was always behind it. They're towards the end, in 14 and 15. Some of their leadership worked hard to get a policy in that said they support cool if it was WTO compliant. We saw some other things like that go on in some of the state cattle organizations. But today our opposition for this is pretty much the same. AMI, our packers. They definitely oppose it. Mexico and Canada oppose it. And our proponents are pretty much still there. I mean, I don't know if people realize that when we had that coalition for country of origin labeling, that was one of the largest coalitions ever in the United States of any industry, all the different groups we had. So we had a huge amount of support. But again, our worst, the damaging part of it was when you have internal groups come out that are opposing it, causes a lot of confusion in D.C.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But they pretty well understand, it's things have matured out with RCAF and U.S. cattlemen's coming on board and more cattlemen getting involved in their farmers unions and farm bureau. Most of the elected officials pretty well understand who represents, especially the generational ranchers in this country. Yeah.
Yeah.
We just leave it there.
I know we're dancing a fine line, and I know you'd mentioned before we went on air that you weren't on here to really degrade any organizations out there, and we're not going to do that here today. But at the same time, I know there's been some tenseness there, and I appreciate your view on that just in general. We're going to take a break here. My guest today is Leo McDonnell, and of course, folks, if you've been in the cattle industry for any period of time, he's been an advocate for our industry for many years, working from that aspect. Of course, they're also a ranch family. I mean, McDonnell Angus, they have cattle in Montana and North Dakota, and if you've ever heard of the Midland Bull Test, well, then of course you'd probably heard of the McDonnell family, and that's all part of that deal. We're going to continue on with Leo when we come back. We're talking about the ruling coming out from the USDA, I believe it was last month, as they addressed the use of product of USA labeling on meat products. Of course, it's other products, not just meat, but in general, we're talking today just about that, as it does affect us as ranchers and the beef industry as well. So we're going to continue more when we come back. Leo McDonnell, our guest. This segment today brought to you by Inherent Select from Zoetis, an innovative multi-breed genetic evaluation for commercial cow-calf producers to help you make more profitable selection and breeding decisions. We'll be back after this.
What if your commercial beef herd could be better than you thought possible? Genetic testing can help give you more confidence about what your herd is made of, and more importantly, what it can be. Inherent Select from Zoetis provides data-driven genetic insights to help you make more informed selection, breeding, and culling decisions about your cows and heifers. The journey from genetic potential to reality begins with Inherent Select. Ask a genetics rep how to save on testing with our whole herd promotion. Go to beefgenetics.com/radio.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we continue on, our topic today is we're looking at the details and just the history of where we're at today and coming to where the USDA issuing a ruling last month on product of USA labeling, and quite an evolution in history that where we are at today to where we came from in that. My guest today is none other than Leo McDonnell, who was really part of that back in 1999 when that began to be a push within the industry. Leo serves as a director emeritus for the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. And Leo, as we were talking there at break, one of the things that's really interesting about the ruling that come from the USDA regarding product of USA labeling is, as you told me at break, you actually ended up with something more than what you guys had been working on many years ago.
Yeah, like I'm telling you, isn't it funny how life works if you just stay in there and don't quit? And have some faith, and have good people around you. But this thing actually came out much better as far as labeling than what we had in the Farm Bill in mandatory cool. In mandatory cool, the restaurants didn't have to label, the fast foods didn't have to label, certain stores with below annual incomes didn't have to label. And as we know, a lot of our beef that comes in goes to those areas, right? To restaurants and fast foods and whatnot. So this covers it all, this rule. Mm-hmm. It covers the whole thing. You are not going to use a USA label or anything that implies USA unless it's born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S. They actually added another piece to it even. So, that's pretty neat. And that, what we do with that and how we market and promote is up to us.
Yeah.
So, but just the fact that it made it unlawful for anybody to use at grade.
Well, and I think that's the thing as I read through this that was interesting to me. There was so much work in the early time of looking at country of origin labeling where it wanted to be a mandatory deal. Well, as we well know, nobody likes anything mandatory.
Well, I don't know. There's some guys pushing for mandatory ID.
Well, yeah, I should
raise our checkoff fees some more. And those particular groups are the ones that often make the claim you said. We don't want mandatory or governments. They're sure pushing for it today, though.
Yeah. Well,
but anyway, you're right. I mean, you got to be so careful when you're working with the government and I think it's a huge mistake that sometimes to be looking at the government to solve your problems, because most of the time they're going to come up with some stuff that ain't going to work anyway. Yeah. And this country was founded on individualisms and freedoms and a type of capitalism much different than what they promote today. But yeah, I mean, it's always better. It's what America was about: individuals, community, getting something done, not always leaning on the government to solve your problem. So this is good. It's all good.
As I was talking about early on, the mandatory look at this, the switch over where we went and say, well, no, you just can't make a claim. You can do whatever you want to. You can sell beef however you want to. You just can't make that claim now. To me, that changed the whole element of this particular idea working in our industry, I feel.
Oh, yeah. If we can get like the checkoff or something to start promoting U.S. beef, I mean, we've got some things happening in our industry in this country that no other country can make claims on. I mean, we still got a problem in Mexico, right? Because we only test 1 to 2% of the beef. Well, we got a lot of Brazilian beef coming in. It's coming in from areas of deforestation. They're using slave labor in places where they shouldn't. They've been caught at that. They bribed a bunch of food inspectors, 2-3 years ago, got caught doing that. And you start throwing all that out, and people, and then they understand how sincere we are in a high quality product in this country. And it'll make a difference. I mean, people care about their climate. Maybe not everybody, but if only 20% care about your climate and all they're going to eat U.S. beef, wow, you put a hell of a hit on your market, a positive hit. Mm-hmm. And the fact that, we got to get prescriptions right now for medicine, right? Mm-hmm. If we want to doctor our cattle. I'll guarantee you there's probably not I don't know for a fact, but I certainly in Mexico don't have to get prescriptions. Paraguay and Brazil, dang sure don't, heck. Mm-hmm. But we do. So we have a much supposedly better product. And if we can take stuff like that and promote it in such a way that builds our image without really attacking so much our competitors, I don't think that's ever a good way to promote. Mm-hmm. But we've got some real opportunities if we can, for example, get our checkoff behind this thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk real quick, because you've hit foreign countries, border countries to the United States. I know in the last time we were talking in the break here about last time country of origin labeling was in there. There's some challenges by WTO. Where are we at now with this truth in labeling? And are we going to have some trade issues? What are you hearing on that?
Well, you're going to have a lot of scare tactics, We've heard Mexico with some rumblings. I haven't heard anything from Canada yet, but they had threatened if we ever went to a voluntary, they would challenge it. We'll see. I mean, this is not a mandated thing. Nobody's required to use U.S. label. It just says if you're going to use U.S. label, it's going to be a U.S. product. Just like if you buy a Ford pickup, it probably better be a Ford pickup, right? And I know when they repealed Cool in 2015, they used the threat of retaliatory tariffs to repeal it, which really bothered me. I just think people have got to start standing up for this country. To hell with this WTO stuff. Here in the last 3-4 years, I mean, the WTO's probably lost 90% of its credibility. A lot of countries are backing away from it. We saw what Great Britain did. And people don't want to be governed by other countries that have different sets of values and principles. That's really, you shouldn't even have to argue that point. So I'm pretty comfortable. I mean, let Mexico come on. They don't want to, they want a U.S. label so they can hide the problems that they got in Mexico in producing beef, or Brazil does, Come on, boys. Yeah. I want that fight. I want to start exposing the stuff that they're doing in this country and why we need truth in labeling. So I hope they do bring it on.
Yeah. Let's just talk a bit about our beef and the export markets that we have. You know, it is a big part of our beef industry. When we talk about our ag industry anymore, it is a global market as well. I'd like to know your thoughts on our export markets and its value to our industry, in addition to if there's any correlation to our subject here today regarding the Product of USA label ruling.
Yeah, well, there's kind of two questions there. And
Yeah.
I will. Back in the 90s, when I sat on NCBA's International Market Committee, I was probably the biggest advocate, and I'm still the biggest advocate for using checkoff dollars to promote our exports. It's such a new dynamic, a broad dynamic to use to increase demand for beef, which increases demand for our cattle, right? I mean, it's like a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
And why people, when you try to address import problems, suddenly they're calling it protectionist, and that's just a cheap shot and a way to confuse people. But I love export markets. I can tell you, when I sat on the CBB, the Cattlemen's Beef Board, I sat on that the international committee for 1 year anyway. Then they booted me off. I asked too many questions, but another story. But anyway, they're required under their contract with the Cattlemen's Beef Board, USMEF is, that when they're promoting beef outside of this country, that they are promoting U.S. beef. Isn't that cool? I mean, I just think that's so neat, because there again, everything I just talked about earlier about us using prescription drugs, about the most respected meat inspection system in the world. That's why our beef brings about $1 premium even over Canada's in the export market. I mean, there's just so much respect for U.S. beef, and so much stuff we can do there. So I just love it. As far as the truth in labeling, I'm hoping now, and it's been unclear, I've got to visit with FSIS, but I'm hoping now that when we do export beef, same product of the USA on it, that it truly is from U.S. cattle, because that's not always been the case.
Yeah.
But hopefully this rule takes care of that. They do talk about our export market in there. It's quite a document. So we'll find out more, but we've got the best story in the world to tell. There's no doubt about it. And the export markets, I mean, it's a big part. It has a very positive effect on our cattle prices, just like the import, because we have a supply-sensitive industry, can have a negative impact. And people, look at it different ways. So I just think you look at them both and try and make them have good business plans in both your import and export to keep these generational ranchers going out here. I mean, you look at the demand for beef and the last since 2015, 2016, and there's no reason we had to go through some of those tough years in the 19, 20, 21. That should have never happened to the cattle producers in this country. And we just need to be more astute as business people.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break here. And when we come back, we're going to continue on. Leo McDonnell is my guest today as we are talking about the USDA's ruling regarding Product of USA labeling on beef and meat products. Now, when we come back, Leo, I want to get into the different segments of our industry, starting with the cow-calf all the way up to the processor, what that means, because as we know, those products, in order to have that label on it, would have to have affidavits or documentation that shows that it was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed. So we're going to talk about that when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. But before we go, this segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at gelbvieh.org. We'll be back after this.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and had excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. You know, just the other day I was having a conversation with my neighbor. We were talking about fly control products, but it's interesting that while some of us are dealing with snow and maybe a little ways off from real heavy fly time of the year, others of you might be heading into that already. However, it's never too late to get started on that. And with New Generation Supplements, they have an answer to fly control. Now, if you're not familiar with New Generation Supplements, I'll bet you've heard of this. You've heard of Smart Lick supplements or the Feed in a Drum, and even their horse products, their equine line called Horse Lick. Well, with New Generation Supplements, it's about 100 little things or more that really make the difference with the products. But when we're talking about fly control, if you want effective and palatable products, try the Smart Lick supplements that are fortified with Alticid. Here's a side note, Alticid, it's safe for those dung beetles if you've ever wondered about that. So not only do the Smart Lick supplements have that Alticid that provide cattle the nutrients they need, but then helps reduce the hornfly populations by breaking that life cycle and preventing biting in adult flies. Contact your Smart Lick dealer today to find out more information about the Smart Lick tub with fly control in it. New Generation Supplements, research-driven, field-proven supplement solutions. To find out more about their products, go to newgensupplements.com. Well, as we turn now towards our interview, back with us here again is Leo McDonnell. Of course, they ranch around Columbus area, Montana, there between Columbus and Park City, Montana. And Midland Bull Test is also part of their operation, in addition to their herds that they have in both Montana and North Dakota. And Leo, as we continue to look at the ruling change that the USDA has put in regarding Product of USA labeling, a lot of folks also kind of referring to this as truth in labeling as well. You had referred to earlier about the Food Safety Inspection Service Guidelines, or FSIS guidelines, that do have all of the information regarding the details of what that labeling rule would require. I have it printed out here, and yes, it is quite a document. I was able to read through most of the things that apply to the beef industry. I wanted to spend some time working through the different segments within our industry as we start down through cow-calf producers and on up, and just talk about this impact with each of those industries. Let's start first with the cow-calf.
Well, there's a couple of different ways you can probably do it. I haven't read all the guidelines. They do talk about how you're supposed to document it and so, but yeah, it's going to have to be documented. It may be documented right on a brand inspection that those cattle are born in the U.S. as the goats of the feeder, you know, but there may be some type of origin claim that you have to use.
So as this works its way through the system, you had mentioned before that there's some of this tracking that's really kind of already being done at this point in time. I mean, is there anything standing out that's anything additional or leading to anything that you know of? You know,
I don't think there's going to be much additional. One of the things that, you know, people I'm sure are aware of anyway, if it didn't happen through Homeland Security, it happened later with but, you know, we have a very robust tracking system in our food supply in case there's a recall or contaminated food or whatever, that they can trace it back and trace it back beyond the processor. And so a lot of these mechanisms are already in place. You know, we may use something like blockchain. You hear a lot more about blockchain. They may be using something like that, but we have a lot of technology and tools available to us that is not going to be difficult.
You had mentioned there's something about blockchain. I'm also going to throw out the other element that's, I know people are probably noodling around as we talk about this tracking, and that would be EID. And, you know, of course, there's, you know, the big controversy now is, again, as we were talking a bit ago, just a voluntary versus a mandatory program. That's the big hang up with some of this. But the conversation with EID tagging has to come up in some element of this. What's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it could sure be a part of it. I mean, we use it a lot in all these program cattle that you see through these video sales, right? With all those cattle carry an 840 tag, so they know it came from that specific ranch under that, whether it was a GAP or NHDC or all natural or whatever. And there's a lot of folks using 840. If there's obviously if there's an incentive on the origin side as far as being U.S. born, that we made available to people. But, you know, the validation for this to the cattle producer won't probably be simpler than it is for most of these programs that we see people marketing feeders under. So, you know, we've been using 840 for I don't know how long, but we use it for management also in the feedlot and on our ranch. And I'm not an advocate of a mandatory program, but the 840 thing definitely would simplify it for a lot of folks if they think they've got premiums there. But
yeah, and I know it definitely is kind of a sticky subject within our industry. Again, it kind of reverts back to my conversation earlier when I said not many of rancher type folks really like to be handed something that says mandatory deal. Nobody likes that necessarily, but at the same time, I mean, that's definitely something out there, and that's what I felt. The program cattle have been doing this for many years, and I think one of the things too is if there's some return to the producer, it kind of validates the use of that, don't you think?
Right. Yeah. Then people will do it, and they'll do whatever's required by whichever groups want the U.S. origin cattle, Mm-hmm. But at the same time, remember this, all your imported beef and everything's labeled coming in. I'm sure it's tracked. I'm sure it has to be tracked with our cattle. If you're buying a semi-load of Canadian feeders, they come in with health papers. They come in on sealed trucks, actually. Mm-hmm. Seals are broke when they unload them. Of course, Mexican cattle still carry the M brand, I'm pretty sure. So this isn't real difficult to do. And there's also maybe they'll use a presumption of origin like we used to use in the school and military program. That's an option too.
So we really haven't got into the nitty-gritty details of what the FSIS guidelines are for product of USA label ruling. In fact, as I read through it, it's pretty straightforward. In fact, they give examples on it as well. But this even comes down to state claims as well. Is that correct, Leo? In terms of people that want to do product of Montana, like in your case, or product of Wyoming in my case, but this kind of even comes down to state claims as well. Yeah.
And, I was just reading it again last night, and yes, they have geographic claims in there, state claims. They also say territory claims. Yeah. I'm not sure what that but my question that I have for FSIS, and maybe it's in here, is are they saying that if I'm going to sell a Montana calf, it's got to be U.S. origin, or does it have to be Montana origin? Mm-hmm. And I think what I'm reading says it has to be U.S. origin. If you want to if you're selling Nebraska beef, which is they have their deal, right?
Yep.
It's probably okay to have a Montana feeder calf down there as long as it's fed in Nebraska, and then they'll call it Nebraska beef. But it's going to have to be a U.S. born calf if you're going to call it. Can't be a Canadian calf anymore. Mm-hmm. It's fed in Nebraska. It's got to be a U.S. fed calf. And that's kind of the way I'm reading it, Justin. Yeah. But, I have not read it in detail. I think a lot of people need to realize, too, this is a final rule. They have a little comment period. It's pretty seldom they have any changes after a final rule. And this actually doesn't even go into effect till January 1st of 2026. Mm-hmm. But it's there, and I think it's going to be pretty solid.
So what has to happen between now and 2026 when it's actually implemented? I know you had commented to me at break that you would kind of hope that it could actually happen a little sooner than 2026, but at the same time, you're not going to turn anything away. It's a step in the direction you were wanting to see happening. In between now and 2026, is there anything this industry is going to have to do or should be doing to get prepared and ready for that? Or is it mainly just given a pretty good leeway for the end user or the packager to make their plans accordingly?
Right. Make their plans, give you time to get some of these programs in place that want to promote a U.S. feeder calf, into a slaughter facility or a retail facility, give them time to get those programs in place, kind of clears the channels. That's what's going on out there. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there'll be some discussion on how they validate it or proof of validation. But like I said, most of that's already in place. These people know where these cattle come from. They have to, part of our food safety system.
One of the things you had talked about there was the validation process, because they talk about that in the approval in the guidelines. Is that going to be any more manpower is that a USDA applying that? Who's kind of overseeing to validate those claims? Because it specifically talks about in these guidelines that every step along the way is going to have that proof of the product, basically. Who's overseeing that process?
That's a good question. And I have not read that in detail, but I've got to think it's like any other PVP program or programs like that. you're going to have to be able to validate that it's a U.S. calf. And the easy way to do that, of course, is 840, but EID. But another way, it's simply an affidavit, or up in our country, in your country, put it right on the brand inspection. You know, it wasn't too many years ago that we had to guarantee that weren't selling Mexican cattle, right? We had to check off a little box here in Montana anyway, or down at the yards. It'll be things like that, fairly simple. And that paperwork will go with the feeder cattle, just like your brands and healths do, and any validations that you have with program cattle, such as your GAFs, you're an HTC. So I kind of see it unfolding like that. I mean, it's going to be pretty seamless, pretty painless. We've been doing this for years and years with other programs that guarantee how cattle are raised and whatnot.
You bet. We're going to take a break here. We've got one more segment back with Leo. And when we do that, I want to specifically talk about the agency's consumer survey. It really does indicate what some had already believed, that in regards to just a U.S. flag on a label, a lot of people would just assume that that animal was born, raised, processed, and packaged here in the U.S. And so we're going to talk about that consumer survey when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we continue on, my guest is Leo McDonnell. We're talking about the truth in labeling, that ruling that came out from the USDA. And as we wrap up our final segment here with Leo, I wanted to get back into the agency's consumer survey, because it addressed probably what many of you have been saying for years, is that if you say something about the USA, the consumer just assumes everything is done in the U.S. And the issue has always been the fact, for many folks that have been proponents of country of origin labeling, or this truth in labeling that we have now, was the fact that just putting a flag on it or saying a product to the USA didn't necessarily mean that it was born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S. Now that voluntary ruling makes that happen. Leo, I want you to expand a little bit more on that consumer survey, because it reinforced what you'd already felt.
Yeah. And I think it's something we all know anyway. I mean, we hear a lot about the way the food industry is going. In fact, that consumers want to know where these products are coming from, how they're raised, and, they want to be more knowledge on that. And so it's no surprise, they work with RTI, an agency that did quite a survey on this. And what they found out was that when consumers buy a product, that beef product that says product of USA or made in USA, and they believe it comes from an animal that was born and raised here in the United States. And, that's not surprising, is it? That they would think. But, there's some other stuff they found in there that's really interesting too. And what was published in the Federal Register disclosed some of the values of marketing a USA beef product. And, if you get a chance, pull it down and read it, because basically they verified what we said years ago. People will pay a premium for products that they know are from the U.S. and actually a pretty significant premium. So it was all good.
Yeah. Well, Leo, as we kind of wrap up here today and looking at this, I know there's a lot of years, as we talked about in the very first segment, a lot of years that you've spent in trying to get to this point in our industry. And I can tell you, early on for me, I had some reservations. It wasn't that I, in theory, didn't want to see our products labeled. I felt there was some value to it for sure. I was just always a little concerned of just maybe the process and how we were putting it all together. And I feel that, as you had talked about before, you ended up with something here that was even better than what you'd originally been working on. And I feel we've sure beat this horse quite extensively and really come up with something that, I think back, when this talk first started happening, seems to be a lot more workable from an industry as a whole, rather than just one segment pointing to the other segment saying, you track your product. I've always felt like from the rancher side, it's been, we say to the packer, you need to track the product. And the packer says back to us, well, you need to track your product. And I feel like we've come to something that's probably about the best of both situations. That's my personal thought. How about you?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I would probably, you talk about beating this horse a lot. I'd probably say this, and this is, it all came about because our label was being used wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why we went after mandatory country of origin labeling. We had packers and retailers claiming stuff that they were selling USA product when they knew it wasn't. We had fast food restaurants doing that. And that's what it was about. Truth in labeling, call it country of origin labeling, whatever. But when you look at as aggressive as that opposition was, one thing that became very clear very fast was there's a lot of money being made off these fraudulent practices of labeling.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have such heated debates and such aggressive opposition to it. Because who in the heck wants to be part of something that misleads consumers? That's the stupidest thing you could do in an industry, is lose your consumers' trust. So, I'm excited about it. It's a tool out there now. One thing about it, the importers, the retailers, whoever, can't be false labeling beef products that come from other countries produced under different standards with our label anymore. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants the integrity of their label compromised by substandard products that they don't even produce. I mean, that was just insane what was going on. And now we got a very clear, very truthful type label if people want to promote USA product. I think we found out here in the last few years that I think we can use the checkoff to promote US product. When I was on the board, they said we couldn't, but now they're saying, well, I think you can. Mm-hmm. And you imagine how that would pull an industry together if we started using some of our checkoff to promote all of our product here in the U.S. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something people will get behind if they have a good campaign. And there's so many positive things that can come out of this if people can leave some of their pettiness behind and just go after this thing. I just think we can really do some great things, Justin.
You bet. Well, Leo, I appreciate you taking the time to go through this. I know, and I've referenced it several times. We talked about in the first segment, you've sure been working a lot of years towards this. And as you had mentioned, I just wrote this down when you said it. It's a tool. And whenever we hear that phrase in today's day and age of our ranching industry, a tool is something you choose to use or you choose not to use. And I think that is one of the crux of this whole labeling ruling that makes it different than what we've seen in the past. And again, not to repeat ourselves, but it's what's probably going to make it thrive a little bit better and be embraced by the industry. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like I said, this is probably one of those cases where you didn't get what you really wanted, but very well might be better. Because the other thing about when you have a voluntary label like this, it requires people to work together from all segments of the industry, and if they want to promote it. And that's never a bad thing when you can get everybody to the table and working together for a common cause. So Let's hope the best comes out of it.
You bet. All right. Well, Leo, again, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Hey, thank you, Justin.
You bet. And again, my guest today, Leo McDonnell, joining us as we talk about the changes that the USDA made last month regarding product of USA labeling. Kind of a big deal, really, especially in light of the fact that this has been an issue in our industry for 25 years. As we heard from Leo, they began working on this back in 1999. And it was interesting to hear his history, his perspective on that. And also, and I think one thing to pull away from that, I don't know if you caught this, I'm sure you probably did, but happy with what we got, just in the fact that it's better than even what they were working on originally many, many years ago. And I know it's unique too, in a way that we really had about every industry group that represents ranchers sign off and be okay with this for the most part. And so I think there's some things from that. And I think if there's one thing I'd pull away from this also is how can we use what we learned and how this came about can we use on issues going forward? Because we also have some other big issues in our industry that continue to divide where people are at on that. And I think it's important if there's some things that we can look from this and say, how can we address these future issues? Maybe there's some lessons to be learned in that as well. Well, stay with us. When we come back, meteorologist Don Day steps in as we take a look at our long-term weather, and the Captain Tim O'Byrne, publisher of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents. We'll be back after this.
Looking for the perfect gift for a gardener or weather enthusiast? Introducing the Tropo, a precision rain gauge that has revolutionized both reliability and convenience. Expertly engineered by meteorologists, the Tropo gauge boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Hope your week is going great and hope you're enjoying the April-May issue of Working Ranch Magazine. We put a lot of energy into each and every one of those magazines, just as much as Justin puts into every podcast radio show, and we're loving them all, and we hope you do too. Now, I want to talk to the photographers out there, ranch photographers. Over the years I've spent here at Working Ranch Magazine, I have had the chance to visit with and work with and promote and utilize the photographs, amazing authentic ranch photography from all types of photographers, from my old friend, the late David Stecklin, all the way to the amateurs that are out there, just got into digital here in the last 10 years or so. It's been an amazing ride for me because I've had the opportunity to look through the archives of, like I say, David Stecklin. He had about 700,000 images on his archive, and everybody's portfolios, everybody's online galleries. And I want to pass along this piece of advice that I got from, and I can't remember exactly who the heck told it to me. It might have been David, might have been, I forget, but it was from a long time ago, but it was very important. Great photographers are at the right place, meaning a high quality location, at the right time with the right equipment. And that's what I want to pass along to you folks. That's what makes a great photographer. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain. And, not to sound a little bit cliche-ish here, but truly, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it has been so evident over the years of the pictures that have been a part of the issues, whether it's inside or on the cover. They do help tell that story, and I think it's a great to do a shout out to our photographers that have been a part of the magazine and the future ones as well. Well, we'll switch gears a bit here as meteorologist Don Day is standing by now as we take a look at our long-term weather. And Don, as we find ourselves here in this weekend, we're kind of in the middle of the latest storm coming through. But as we move through, and this storm that we're seeing here in our part of the country moves on out, you're anticipating things to kind of settle just a little bit.
Yeah, they'll settle, not for long, but it's been very stormy, as we know, across a lot of the U.S. over the last 2 or 3 weeks, really across coast to coast, whether it's a lot of rain in the central and southeast, some severe weather, the Great Lakes, the upper Midwest, New England has had some snow getting pretty far south, and of course the northern plains and northern Rockies just getting done with a pretty big snow event in many areas. But we are going to see the weather kind of take a breather. It's been pretty active for the last 3 or 4 weeks, so having a little bit of a break is to be expected. So for those of you impacted by this recent spell of stormy weather, you will have a little bit of a breather, although I do expect around just after the 18th or 19th of April, the things to start to ramp up and get busy again.
So when you look at the latter part of the month of April for those next tier of storms that could be coming through, how is that going to come in? Do you have any indication? Is it going to be more out of the northwest, or are we going to see it coming through California more in the southwest? I mean, what are you seeing?
Well, you naturally start to see the jet stream wanting to be a little bit more towards the north. And you do tend to see precipitation in places like Southern California and Arizona, New Mexico, those southern southwest states. You start to see your average precipitation decrease this time of year because more often than not, the jet stream is still riding through the Gulf of Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and across the northern tier of the U.S. And I think that's what we're going to see. Mm-hmm. But as those systems go across the northern part of the U.S., by the time they get to the Midwest and the East, they're dragging some form of a cold front through. And that colder air in those northern latitudes still is pretty chilly. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of warm, moist air this time of year that's forming along the Gulf Coast, those lower latitudes. And that contrast you get in spring does tend to make that storm track be a little more north, but still makes the weather very active.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the other thing across the country that has been really dramatic here in the last couple of weeks as well, not only the storms that we've seen in the west and as it's carried on through the east, but the severe storm down in the southern area, in the tornado belt in that area, that's been rough. Are they gonna see a reprieve as we see our weather kind of moderate a bit? Are they also going to see a reprieve from that severe weather?
They won't. It's just the time of year. I mean, we're at the time of year where the average amount of tornado frequency and severe weather really starts to go up, and you see it start in those southern areas. Now, that doesn't mean it's continuous. There will be some breaks. It's just that we are heading towards the time of year where the frequency of tornadoes especially really starts to go up in that part of the U.S. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've had severe weather. We've had some tornadoes. The number of tornadoes so far, though, is a little bit below the average, so to speak, but we can catch up in a real hurry with some of these frontal systems, especially mid to late April. Mid to late April into early May, you always got to make sure your hard hat's on in some parts of the U.S. And we really see that in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana this time of year, and that just starts to spread to the north and east as we go further into the month.
Yeah. Okay, we haven't checked in for a while on this, but kind of give us the El Nino update and where things are progressing based upon where you thought they would be.
Well, right now we're having a funeral wake for El Nino. We're putting El Nino away here for a little bit. The sea surface temperatures out in the Pacific are still a little bit on the warm side, but boy, the depth of the warmth of the water is really, really shrinking. And we're pretty much going into neutral status right now. We're still anticipating that during the summer, we will be into the La Nina, where those sea surface temperatures along the equator begin to get below average and start to continue their trend of going downward. I think for the rest of the spring season, La Nina is really not going to be an impact because we still have those warmer sea surface temperatures, but La Nina is something that in future podcasts we should talk about some more because it has the chance to maybe impact some of our summer season, especially the second half of it.
Yep. Okay. Well, that was actually something that I had on my notes of things to do at some point, was that we could kind of sit down and talk about not really so much the spring or early summer, but what's the second half of summer and fall starting to look like with this change, as you had mentioned, as we have getting ready to close the casket on El Nino and what that's going to look like. So we'll plan to do that at a future show if we can.
I think that'd be a good idea.
You bet. All right. Well, Don, appreciate the input here today and giving us an idea of what we have in store for us, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.
And if you want to tune in each and every morning and find out what's happening across the country with weather, you can find Don's daily video podcast by going to his website at dayweather.com. It'll give you a link to his YouTube channel, or you can search right in YouTube as well. Well, stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk about what's in store for next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show after this. I encourage you to join us next week on the Working Ranch Radio Show as Dr. Michael Apley from Kansas State University's College of Veterinary Medicine will be joining us as he will be discussing with us the status of using antibiotics, growth promotants or implants that we hear about, as well as feed supplements. And when I'm talking about that, I mean in things like ionophores and beta agonists in the usage of our food animals to improve livestock efficiency. Pretty deep dive into some of this, and I think you'll find the conversation very, very valuable, very useful, just in terms of some management things to be thinking about, and also just in response to some of the things and issues that come up within our own industry regarding food safety and animal welfare as well. So be sure to tune in on next week's show. Before we head out, if you do want to get a hold of me, it's pretty simple. You can send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Be sure to tune in next week at the same time, same place, or on your favorite podcast provider. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.